Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد، جيل من شعب مجاهد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا،
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا
رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It is the evening of the 4th of February 2024. It is 22:39 of the evening. And we come to you tonight with a program on the Ukraine war and the NATO implosion, or the coming NATO implosion, I should say. And I hope that those of you who were with us last night enjoyed or found the episode on Malthusianism, social Darwinism, and its influence on so-called ecological politics to be an interesting one. Tonight we are perhaps back with more regular fare, though of course your questions will also help guide the live stream as we go along. Now, as is customary, we will begin by talking to and greeting the people who are in the chat so far. So we've got Comrade Hello Hi, Adam Marks, good evening to both of you. Rodrigo Martincic says, Hola camaradas from Brazil. Okay, well, good to have you with us. Getting a Central and Southern American following here, that's always good. Saludos comrades, says Gonzalo Cabrera from Spain. Good evening to Heidi, who's up in Edinburgh. And good morning to Ash down there in Melbourne. And Paul Gassari, who says hello all. And President Jesus, good afternoon to you out there in Gavin Newsom land. That day will come, who says salutations from exotic Birmingham, the place with more canals than Venice. At least that's what the tourist board said when I used to go to university there. If you, of course, you're referring to Birmingham in the West Midlands of England. Brad Wall, good evening to you. Rianne, good evening to you from the Black Flag. ID asks, are you going to talk more shit about MAGA communism? Well, that depends. What does the audience demand? I hadn't planned to talk about that. I talked a little bit about that a few streams ago. Before I go any further with it, I did read Haz's blog on that, Foundations, basically. If I'm going to talk any more about it, what I want to do is I want to go back and read what the people who are advocating for it have put out recently, because I don't want to talk about it just from the perspective of something I read well over a year ago. So I may go back to it if there's a demand to do so. If so, then I will need to take some time to read and consider what the people who put it forward have written and advocated for in more recent times. So if you want me to do that, let me know, and I will plan accordingly. Rianne, you swear you're not an anarchist. Okay, well, we'll believe you for now. Very good evening to Otis, who's coming to us from Newcastle. Good to see you here, up there in the wild northeast of England. Martin, who's joining us from a rainy and chilly location in the United States. My ancestors didn't escape England for this. Well, the Anglos take the weather with them, to paraphrase Crowded House. Good evening to C. Bolt in Wales. A Cymry in England. So you're a Welshman in England. Vitam Tavarish says Staffy97. How's your morning, afternoon, evening going? Going pretty well. I'm making progress on my personal targets on distance running, but that's another story. Battle Cossack says various things in Spanish, which I can just about understand. Certainly understand this one. Larga vida al marxismo, leninismo, maoismo. Oh, interesting. We have an MLM in the chat. That's excellent ideological diversity there. CP says, hi, Ian Foster. Good evening to you, comrade. Right, okay, so we are advertised in all the correct locations. We have greeted everybody in the chat. So it is time to begin our broadcast for the evening. And tonight we are going to be looking at the latest from Battlefield Ukraine, you could say. And then we're going to be going on to talk about, at the risk of looking a fool if it doesn't come off, possible outcomes for the future. I wouldn't be English if I didn't have a giant oversized mug of tea with me. So, same form as always in the chat. If you have questions that you want to see addressed, always feel free to put them in there. And I will respond to them when I've got to the end of what I've got scheduled. If I miss one out, or if you've put one in and you think it's been overlooked, post it again and we'll get to it. If I feel like I can't answer your question tonight, make a note of it and email it to me at the following address, which I'm going to put into the chat as always. If you just hold on for a moment. So, Rianne asks, Yorkshire Gold or PG Tips? It's Yorkshire Tea, which is probably going to be regarded as some act of treachery by those who are more militant in their adherence to the historic boundaries of Lancashire, to drink something that comes branded from the enemy county. But you know what? We can't take our regional rivalries too seriously. And besides, this tea bag's probably only seen Yorkshire when it travelled through it on a lorry somewhere, you know. All the tea is, of course, not grown in Britain. that it is associated with us at all is only a triumph of branding and imperialism. And we've got more people coming in here. Yu Wan from Phoenix, Arizona. AJ Williamson, who says present and correct. Staffy97 says Tovarish means comrades and Witam means hello in Polish. Tovarish I got because having watched an awful lot of Soviet-era Great Patriotic War movies on the Mosfilm YouTube channel, Tovarish is one of the first words you pick up. Tovarish Stalin, of course, being the best line of all. We got opinions on tea. Comrade Hello Hi says PG Tips is better, Ultra Yorkshire tea. Well, now we have the tea clash. Okay. Hello to Zim Left Radio, who's joined us. Okay, so getting to the meat of the issue tonight, and that is, of course, the war in Ukraine and what it will tell us about the various different outcomes we can see in the future. Now, I will encourage you, if you haven't looked at it already, to look at a map, which I'm going to drop into the chat here, to illustrate the points that I was making. And that's a map that is pro-NATO, or whoever runs it, whatever team runs it is pro-NATO. But just go on it if you've got the capacity to do so at the moment, if you're near a computer. It might not work too well on a phone. But that's a pro-NATO map. But if you look on it, just call it up and you can see the red markings on that map illustrate the Russian military activity. And the blue ones, Ukrainian military activity. You can see not a lot of blue on there, I don't think. Russian army conducting an awful lot of shelling and assaults all the way up and down the front line. Now, big news from today was that the Russian army continues its assault around Avdiivka, which is the town just outside of Donetsk city. If you look on a map of Ukraine, look at Donetsk city. Avdiivka is basically directly north of Donetsk city, and that's where the Ukrainian forces, perhaps it's more accurate to call them NATO forces, have been shelling Donetsk city for the last, well, almost 10 years now. So clearly an objective of the Russian forces is to close this off and force them out. And according to even Ukrainian reports coming out now, there is now an encirclement going on, or starting to be constructed, around Avdiivka. The Russians leaving only really one clear road out of the town. Apparently most of the town is a ruin. And it's only a matter of time now before the Ukrainians are cut off and forced into essentially a cauldron. And they will have two choices, die horrendously or surrender. Apparently, and now this is to be taken with perhaps a bucket full of salt, the story coming out of the Kiev regime is that, and this is obviously from Zaluzny's sympathizers, Zaluzny is claiming that he wanted to withdraw from Avdiivka. Zelensky said no, not one step back again, in his typical style. Make of that what you will. Zelensky keeps adopting this point of view if you believe the Ukrainian sources, which are clearly linked to Zaluzny. But certainly it seems to be the case that when it came to Artemovsk or Bakhmut, back at the, this time last year when that battlefield was hotting up, when the Wagner group was still active around there. And also now with Avdiivka and some other places as well. The story has come out over and over again that that Zaluzny favoured giving up ground to essentially preserve forces. And Zelensky basically just kept saying, no, 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 we will hold it at all costs. Which begs the question, like, exactly what the hell are the NATO contingent playing at? Is this Zelensky's decision, or is it their decision? Because Zelensky, of course, is nominally the commander-in-chief, but if you read even the reports about the summer offensive of last year, the disaster that took place last year. Of course, Zaluzny and General Syrski are the ones who have been the men with their names on it in terms of potentially designing it. But even in the bourgeois press in the Western world, you got reports that this was all designed really by the chiefs of the general staffs of France a little bit, but mostly Britain and the United States. It was their senior officers and planners who came up with the idea for the offensive in Zaporozhye. Of course, an offensive that they, as I have said many times, advertised for 6 months beforehand and then attacked exactly where they said they would. I mean, you really do have to wonder about these people. But given that they designed all of that, and it's been admitted that they designed all of that, that it had General Milley, if you remember him, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, and Admiral Radakin, the chief of the defense staff of Britain, were key to at least affixing their seals on that. I don't think they did the actual planning. So what is it that Zelensky is doing here? Is Zelensky acting according to some sort of wild, presumably narcotic-fueled impulse about the need to concede no territory, concede nothing to the Russians? Is this as a result of a political decision that Zelensky and Yermak, his spin doctor, Svengali figure, have they made this decision that the way to secure Zelensky's position domestically is to adopt the most hardline stance possible? Well, that's conceivable. It's the kind of cynical maneuver that some sort of political novice like Zelensky would carry out. But given that Zelensky's position is entirely dependent on his ability to be of use to U.S. imperialism. He's a pure puppet of U.S. imperialism and to a certain extent British imperialism as well. Well, is it his insistence or is this coming from his handlers? Because if you think about it in terms of like, well, what is it that the U.S. imperialists and the British imperialists and their European, allies, you would be, or vassals if you prefer, what is it that they're after with all of this? What would be gained for them by having the Ukrainian army stand and fight last year in Bakhmut or Artyomovsk and lose, apparently according to some sources, 40-odd thousand men in doing so? What was gained there, other than, of course, just making the advance for the Russians as difficult and elongated and costly as possible? And given that the motivation for all of this seems to have been just to extend the war as long as they possibly can, cost the Russians as much as they possibly can, in the hope that either the sanctions start working or, the evil Tsar Putin is disposed of in some sort of internal, either a color revolution, a palace coup, something will pop up in terms of a revolt of the elites or something, and that this is all going to be helped by just keeping the war dragging on and being as costly as possible in terms of men and material. Then the decision of Zelensky to just keep men in these now surrounded areas and keep them fighting at all costs, it starts to make a little bit more sense when you consider that this is something that the NATO handlers who actually run things have decided for him, and have decided that this is what must happen, and that we go back to Clausewitz again. The war is it's a paraphrase, not a direct quote. War being the continuation of politics by other means. Okay, so given that the political objective of the Ukraine war on the part of US imperialism is to make sure that it goes on as long as possible, make sure that it costs the Russians as much as possible in terms of casualties, in terms of treasury, shall we say, blood and treasure, the old phrase. And this gives them a chance to try and work something else in the financial sphere or the economic sphere. To gives the chance for the sanctions to work, gives the chance for the oligarchs to revolt en masse. Not that that would make much difference these days, given that these people hold absolutely no social weight outside of their own circles, and that if anybody tried to side with the oligarchs in a revolt against Putin, I think that the Russian people themselves would probably have them strung up from the nearest lamppost. So, but this is the thinking in Washington and London. Just keep it going. Just keep it going. Just keep it as being as costly and difficult as possible. And this seems to have been the guiding principle behind all of this. I mean, yes, they had their assault, but their assault was based, again, on faulty political assumptions, and also very deeply flawed military assumptions, which they had to know were wrong. So I think that the way in which we have to observe this, where we have to look and analyze the situation with regard to Zelensky's insistence over and over and over again that the Ukrainian armed forces stand and fight and don't withdraw from anywhere, this makes no sense from any conceivable point of view. That if you're considering this just as a military tactical question, or from the point of view if you take seriously, for instance, the argument that has been put forward by various leftists in Britain and in the United States over the last 2 years, that this is all about preserving Ukraine's sovereignty, saving Ukraine, save Ukraine to fight another day, etc., etc. If you take that seriously, and if you think that that is what is guiding the great hero Zelensky, then why on earth would he insist over and over and over again, in the face of odds that everybody admits are catastrophic, to keep some of the best trained and best equipped Ukrainian troops in death zones that everybody knows is a death zone, that the Ukrainian armed forces commanders have told him is a death zone? Why insist on keeping those troops there if you have no way of breaking out, you have no way of carrying out an effective counter-offensive in places like Bakhmut or now Avdiivka? You have no way of lifting the siege. You don't have enough men, you don't have enough material. All the men last year and the decent material got sent to the Zaporozhye region and then slaughtered in that useless offensive in the summer, starting in June of last year. So again, let's go back to the political level. What is the conceivable explanation here? To carry on our thought experiment here, to quote Sam Harris, let's think about what this means. If you take seriously, as I said, the idea that this is all about preserving Ukrainian sovereignty, okay, let's roll with that for a moment. Let's assume that that is Zelensky and the others' objective. Let's just put aside everything else that we know about them for now. Okay, why do this? Why sacrifice like hundreds of thousands of men in these useless operations to defend territory which you have not only lost, but it has cost you a gigantic amount in losing, and it didn't bring you anything in terms of an advantage? I mean, Zelensky has gone on record on multiple times, and he has said this from a military point of view, it seems to me, quite some justification, that they should dig in and go over to a defensive operation, which would make a good deal more sense. This is something that Scott Ritter said many months ago in one of his interviews, that if he was given the opportunity to be in charge of the Ukrainian armed forces, that he would withdraw them to the other bank of the Dnieper River, dig in there, and then that would give you essentially a very defensible position against the Russians. That would, of course, though, involve giving up a gigantic amount of territory and potentially demoralizing the Ukrainian armed forces and causing potential political problems in Kiev. But that would be the sensible military decision. And all the military decisions that Zelensky has taken over the last 2 years have only led to an enormous amount of Ukrainian deaths. The only successful one that you could argue that he took was the offensive around the Kharkov area, which we'll return to in just a moment. And that only succeeded because the Russians didn't have enough men. They were having to fundamentally reorganize the armed force that they'd sent into Ukraine back in February of 2022. And that this resulted in them having too few units based up around the northern area, which allowed the Ukrainians to advance. And the Russians didn't panic. They didn't run away. They withdrew in good order. So that's the one occasion when the great hero Zelensky and his military planners secured a victory. And it was a victory that was basically like pushing an open door. Everything else has been a disaster. And it comes back to, it starts with the motivations of Ukraine's puppet masters, which again come back to just keeping the war going and making it as bloody and difficult as possible. And as Lindsey Graham himself said, it's best money we've ever spent, because they think that if they just keep it going, if they just make it as difficult as they can, that something will come up. And this is why Zelensky is giving the orders that he is. It's not because he's just coming up with this off the top of his head. He's being told to do this, I think. I think he's being advised strongly, shall we say, by the many different conversations that he has on a daily basis with the various different handlers that he has, that he has to stand firm. You can't give up territory. You can't let Putin advance. You can't let Putin win. You must fight to the bitter end, fight for every scrap of territory, etc., etc. That's what has been designed for him. So what does it mean then when you had this talk that was out in the press recently in the imperialist countries about Ukraine going over to the defensive? Well, that meant, I think, that there was a debate going on inside London and Washington about what to do. So you got the people who in London and Washington obviously were backing Zelensky. There was clearly a faction that were backing him. And they were the ones advocating for going over to the defensive, hanging on to as much of Ukraine as they possibly could, and then being able to rebuild from a more solid defensive position. Now, they probably left it way too late to do that, but that was their position. Then you had others who, in London and in Washington, who were basically saying, no, we must continue as we are, we must throw everything at this. This is the point of view, by the way, of like key people in the sort of the opinion forming sections of the British ruling class, like Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, whose article I mentioned the other day. And it was an unhinged article, which is worthy of going through in probably tomorrow's program, to be honest. But the gist of it is basically that Britain and the EU must continue to give Ukraine everything it needs to sustain the fight. We can't let the evil one win. We must continue this war. Now, of course, this ludicrous, well, I won't say ludicrous, actually. This policy that they are pursuing doesn't even make sense if the idea was that they actually wanted to strengthen the Russian comprador bourgeoisie. No faction in Russia has been weakened more than them by this last 2 years. These people's political sway is now almost nothing. They did have a place within the Putin system, represented by various different characters who remained quite close to Putin politically and personally, like Anatoly Chubais had a very well remunerated position as the climate change advisor, which is a non-job, but basically he was there to represent the interests of the Yeltsin clique within the Putin system. All those people have been completely marginalized over the last 2 years, and their power continues to shrink the longer this goes on. So this doesn't make a great deal of sense, but I think we're beyond rationality now. We're into the imperialist planners in London and Washington are just into the realm of, well, what is technically referred to in internet parlance as copium. They're just coping now. They're just coping and hoping that something fundamental changes inside Russia. But I think that the changes that they've managed to inspire inside the Russian Federation are not developing in the direction of favorability towards a comprador regime. If anything, they're going in the other direction. So, Avdiivka about to fall at some point soon, within the next few weeks. The Russians also carrying out heavy bombing and raiding operations up in the north around Kharkov, which they've never taken, of course. They came close to it earlier on in the war, but they left there in autumn of 2022. But now it looks as if they are getting ready to push back in. And you can start to see the way in which the Russians are choosing to fight the war by observing what they're doing in places like Kharkov, where they are systematically trying to eliminate all the Ukrainian strong points, the Ukrainians' ability to resupply their forces. They've eliminated apparently a lot of Ukrainian officers up there, according to Russian sources. And they're aiming to basically isolate the forces up there, cut them off from reinforcements, batter them as much as they possibly can with their artillery and their air force before making some kind of move in the Kharkov area, probably after the period of March 15th to 17th, which is, of course, the days set aside for the Russian presidential election. Now, that is, of course, a political consideration which Putin will have made after he wins, and I would like Nikolai Kharitonov, the KPRF candidate, to get like 30-odd%, but I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Putin's going to get about 70%. I think the KPRF will get between 15 to 20, and the LDPR, Zhirinovsky's old party, will be below them. Now, I'd love for the KPRF to be higher, but I don't see it at the moment. A bit unjust, considering that much of what has happened in the special military operation comes really from pressure and activity that they've conducted over the last 10 years, but this is the way that bourgeois politics rolls. So, after this, though, it would seem to be likely, and in fact, according to John Helmer of the website Dances with Bears, long-time Russia correspondent and observer of events there, who has a lot of sources in Russia, it's likely to be the case that they go after the Kharkov region after the election, and that this will be a way in which that they will look to start bringing about, if not an end game, then the next evolution of the special military operation, the taking of the area around Kharkov. And apparently, as I said earlier, the Ukrainians all the way across the front line now are already struggling with another big problem, which is a lack of experienced field officers, like the men who actually do the commanding of forces on the ground. Now, they can't train these guys up overnight. To actually command men in the field takes a good deal of training and battlefield experience. Now, of course, in extreme circumstances, men can learn on the job, but they're running out of men who are capable of fulfilling those positions. And as Helmer points out in one of his recent articles, it's going to be near impossible for them to get even like disguised NATO troops to fill those positions, because, of course, NATO troops, even if they're from the bigger armies, so for instance Germany or France or Italy or Britain or America, none of these guys don't speak either Russian or Ukrainian, many of them, and even if they tried to learn some, being able to step in and command men in a language you barely know on a battlefield seems like a recipe for disaster. So they are in severe trouble, and the Russians know that and will continue to soften them up, shall we say, until they're ready to move. And they will probably move in the spring, later spring or summer, in a more decisive way. Until then, though, what we're going to see is these slow grinding operations, of the likes of which are going on definitely around Avdiivka at the moment, but they're also grinding out territory slowly all the way across the front line, it would seem. Slowly but surely, it is taking shape how they are conducting their operation here, which is to, again, as I said, eliminate the Ukrainians' ability to, or NATO's ability to resupply, eliminate all the heavy weaponry and the stocks of heavy weaponry, eliminate ammo dumps, kill as many of the best troops as they can via artillery strikes, rocket fire, airstrikes, etc., drone operations as well. And once they've done all that and they've softened it up so that they can then effectively deploy Russian armor, which they've been doing in limited bursts up and down the front line at the moment, then they will oh, we've got a we have a pro-NATO person in the chat. I will come to them later. Then they will move in on the Ukrainian positions and slowly push them backwards. Okay. We have somebody who's joined us from apparently the NATO press corps. So let's deal with him. I'm going to read out this comment from somebody who refers to himself, and I'm presuming that this is a gentleman, as Mutanda. Name seems familiar. I can't think from where. Who says the following: for all the battlefield losses, NATO have continued striking Russian ships around Crimea. I fear that the UK will keep upping the ante with direct attacks on Russian territory itself. Okay, I misread your comment. I assumed you were here from the NAFO squad. It doesn't appear as if you are. My apologies for mischaracterizing you there. Look, the striking of Russian ships doesn't really matter in terms of the ability of the Russian armed forces to wage their campaign on the battlefield. What they've done, the Ukrainians, under the direction of the British, is hit like corvettes and patrol boats that are of no consequence to the special military operation whatsoever. These are PR moves designed to bolster domestic morale in Ukraine and to, of course, bolster political support in European capitals by showing that Ukraine, or more likely British and American intelligence, are capable of striking at the Russians, striking at targets which are of no relevance. They're playing no role in a special military operation whatsoever. Now, they've already done direct attacks inside Russia itself. Like, are we seriously saying that these no-hopers, these like Russian defectors who crossed the border, weren't there under the direction of the British and the United States? They've already done that. They've already done terrorist campaigns, etc. This was all laid out, by the way. We've covered this many times before in the document that Kit Clarenberg reported on in the Grey Zone from the likes of Chris Donnelly and people like that. The way in which the British intelligence officials want to wage this war now, going forward, implies that they are the ones, at least partly, who support the idea of putting Budanov in as commander-in-chief, because his speciality is sabotage and terroristic operations. So the Russians know very well who's behind all these attacks, and they know very well that the way in which the war is evolving is going to be one in which the focus is going to be on bombings, assassinations, hit squads behind the Russian lines, those type of things, because they're running out of frontline troops, they're running out of resources. They can't get more resources coming in sufficient amounts from the United States, even if Michael Jackson, who is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, I'm joking there, by the way, I'm using Dmitry Medvedev's line. It's Mike Johnson, of course. Even if he agrees with Biden some sort of border deal and agrees to unlock funding for Ukraine, well, we're getting a lot of reports from even sources inside the United States that the much vaunted military-industrial complex isn't capable of supplying ammunition to Ukraine in the sufficient quantities that it requires. Neither is all of the industrial capacity of Europe, which is much diminished, by the way, nor is Britain, nor is anywhere else. And the South Korean puppet regime is now having a fit because they supplied all this weaponry to Ukraine, to NATO really, and they did so at the risk then of the Russians opening up full relations again with the DPRK, which I think they were going to do anyway. But it certainly made the Russian job a lot easier to just turn around to the South Korean regime and say, well, you've supplied our enemy, so now we will go into business with yours. So they don't have anybody who can supply Ukraine in the quantities that they would need. And this presents an enormous problem because they can't sustain this level of battering that the Ukrainians are taking on the front line. So the way in which this now will degenerate is into the what's been discussed before. As the Russians continue to tighten the noose around Kharkov in the north, and for what it's worth, what I guess that they will do there, again, guesswork is always dangerous because you always run the risk of being proven wrong by events, but Kharkov is, of course, the second biggest city in Ukraine, very large place, significant industrial base, I think, still within it. So it's going to be a very difficult one to take, and so I think that the Russians will show a degree of patience here and that they will take all land around it eventually and essentially seal off Kharkov and put it under siege, is my guess. I don't know if they're going to try and repeat what they did in Mariupol, but Kharkov is considerably bigger, has a much higher civilian population, and the people running the Ukrainian regime now are even more brutal and ruthless with regards to civilian populations than they were even 18 months ago when the siege of Mariupol was on. So we'll have to see how that works out. But bear in mind also, the Russian government has given us clear indications of the way in which they want to go, which is take Kharkov, take pretty much everywhere down to Odessa eventually, and then, of course, they will probably pause again to see if the American imperialists in particular are in the mood for some sort of negotiation. I doubt they will be. But eventually what's going to happen is that the map posted up by Dmitry Medvedev is going to come true, which is that Novorossiya and Malorossiya, which is the long, Novorossiya being the long strip going all the way from Kharkov down to Odessa, and then Malorossiya being the internal part of Ukraine up to the borders of what was once the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's what's going to go eventually, after much more fighting, to the Russians. Now, the question then arises, at what point do the Russians try to trigger the collapse of the Ukrainian state entirely? That's a question that we keep coming back to here, which is, well, how much longer can the current way of war persist, given that Zelensky has a severe political problem. Even if he manages to sack Zaluzny and replace him with Budanov, they're visibly losing now. And as with anything else, when any state is visibly losing, the fractures all start to emerge, and especially in a state as corrupt and squalid as Ukraine is, run by these like horrendous comprador figures, they are all already fighting like rats in a sack, and as the military situation deteriorates, it's only going to get worse. So at what point does US imperialism decide to pull the plug, take the government to Lvov, declare that to be the real Ukraine, and stick that in NATO or something like that? These are questions that, of course, we can't answer for now. We can only speculate upon. But your point is, and here I will come to the point about NATO itself. The point about NATO itself is that, again, it was already revealed as an organization that was no longer particularly formidable. And that was revealed actually before the start of the special military operation. This was revealed by the fact that the NATO armies had been consistently shrinking for years, as, by the way, the industrial base of all the countries in NATO shrank. And for this operation, they were convinced that their outsourced army in Ukraine would do the job for them of ultimately causing the collapse of the Putin system, shall we say. This, of course, proved to be a completely erroneous assumption. But there's this sort of mad dash around in Britain to try and revive military industrial production. They are talking about we're going to revive military shipbuilding. Well, good luck with that, considering that the one of the two British aircraft carriers that they've built domestically in recent years is currently completely unable to sail. Can't go and join the flotilla of impotents down in the Red Sea. So they clearly don't have the skills to build a decent ship in Britain at the moment, and they're going to try and revive shipbuilding, according to the strategy document I've seen from the British government, basically by chucking money at the private operators and hoping that they come through. That seems to be the tactic. And chucking money at the BAE Systems and others and hoping that they'll expand production. They may get a bit of expanded production, but always bear in mind this: the private companies, the owners of these arms manufacturers, they will not do the level of investment and industrial expansion required. Not even now all the politicians in London running around with their hair on fire screaming, "Oh my God, Putin is coming, Putin is coming," as if, Putin's sailing up the Thames in a Russian submarine and he's going to pop the hatch open next to the Houses of Parliament and plant the Russian flag in it. Actually, that sounds quite entertaining. I hope he does do that. But the fact is that without sufficient level of profitability, which at the moment just simply doesn't exist in Britain, the owners of like BAE Systems and others, even with all the screaming coming from the government, they're not going to expand capacity enough to either equip a new version of the British Army, never mind be able to resupply Ukraine. And here we get to the question of collapse of NATO. So not only do they have the same industrial problem, in Britain's extreme, in that its industrial base is eroded to a far greater degree than France, Germany, Italy, or some of the other European nations. There were those who still have manufacturing bases to speak of. We are, of course, the country that has gone down the furthest in the route of deindustrialization. But all of them suffer from the same malady, which is all stemming from, of course, the declining rate of profit when it comes to manufacturing, deindustrialization, which is built into imperialism. It's there in the foundations of it. It's why imperialism takes off in the late 19th century in the first place. Insufficient profit being realized on the employment of workers in labor-intensive industries or industries that are capital-intensive. Hence capital being invested overseas. Deindustrialization of the country being, of course, happening, of course, first in Britain, as Lenin observed back in 1916. So, chucking a load of money at this isn't going to bring the results that they're looking for. They all get some upscale production, but the other problem is, of course, and even the free sheet rag, the metro in Britain, that you find on the train or on the bus, is now admitting in stories that it runs inside its paper that if Britain in its current state went up against the Russian armed forces, they wouldn't last 2 months, which leads all these MPs to scream and run around going, "Oh my God, conscription," and then get surprised when the polling results come back saying nobody wants to be called up. Because you have now, not just in Britain, but in France and increasingly in Germany, you have all of these regimes facing an increasing crisis of legitimacy. All of the institutions that used to be presented to the population as something that was worthy of respect, sort of pillars of the bourgeois regime. In England it used to be, or I should say in Britain it used to be, the monarchy, the official church, and to a certain extent like the parliament to a degree. Used to be presented as certainly the pillars of British civilization. And, well, how's that looking these days? You have a monarchy which still has some level of support, but which has been disgraced by multiple scandals for many, many years. You have a current monarch who is now best known for his friendship with a notorious dead paedophile in the form of Jimmy Savile. You have his idiot son, who's not much better. The institution itself is more famous for divorces and dodgy sex scandals. You have a political system which is despised, even amongst higher levels of the petty bourgeoisie. It's despised. You have some parts of that political system which are so nakedly corrupt, like the House of Lords in Britain, is are regarded quite rightly as just a corruption machine, a machine for paying people off, basically, by giving them titles. You have a pervasive sense of negativity around the country based on years and years, nearly 15 years now, actually 16 years. If you want to stretch it a little bit back a little bit further, 17 years, back to 2007 when things started going wrong in the British economy, of collapse and stagnation. You have a government which only knows how to do two things: continually press the quantitative easing button over the last 16 years and reinflate the property bubble, thus making housing more and more unaffordable. Essentially, you have a perfect scenario for triggering a collapse if you actually tried to inspire waves of patriotism within the population. It's just not going to work. Like, even back in 1914, you could still call upon reserves of national pride that had been instilled in the population over institutions like the monarchy, which I think was always overstated in terms of just how popular it was, but it was more popular then than it is now. Now you've got none of these institutions carry any weight with even people who are self-described reactionaries. It's a complete crisis of legitimacy for the system. And if you look at what is happening in France, it is not much better. If you look at what is happening in Germany, increasingly the same results apply. And in Italy, well, you've had a crisis of legitimacy there for many, many decades, since the implosion of all of the major Italian political parties in the early 1990s. And so these aren't countries that can suddenly turn on a dime and do some sort of mass military mobilization. Again, don't have the industrial capacity and don't have the political capacity. So where are they going to go? The answer is, of course, to just keep throwing money at Ukraine and hope that they can continue dying in huge numbers in order to guide this war into the finish that some of the slightly more intelligent planners in London and Washington have in mind, which is to convert it into a sort of insurgency terrorist campaign. But this will, of course, not go their way. The Russians know exactly what they have planned. And the crisis of legitimacy that is afflicting all the national governments and afflicting, by the way, the European Union, for all the mouth-breathing dribblers in Britain's desperate desire to get back into it so they can go on holiday to France without showing their fucking passports. All of that faces a crisis of legitimacy all the way across Europe. All the way across Europe, not just in France or Germany or in Italy now, but also Eastern Europe, also in Poland, also in Romania, also in Hungary. So these, the nations themselves face crises. The supranational institutions that are used by US imperialism and its partners to try and manage Europe, all of these face a crisis of legitimacy. The defeat that will come in Ukraine and become glaringly obvious soon, if it's not obvious already, will cause an implosion in the belief in NATO that will bring into question its existence. Now, this leads to the question of, well, is Trump going to pull the plug on NATO? Will they, dispose of him if he does? Well, you might not need to. We might reach the point where, in European terms, you've got a crisis of legitimacy in the EU, a crisis of legitimacy in all the national governments, and NATO might become just inoperable because all of these countries are going to be essentially locked in such major political crises that they can't mobilize for war. They're in too bad of an economic state to rebuild their industrial bases, and they're in too much of a crisis to deal with any of this external stuff. Now, of course, some might say that might motivate them to try and stage a mad dash for a war with Russia. And it's entirely possible that may occur if some real lunatic gets in charge of things. But before that happens, we will have many opportunities to make positive interventions to steer things in another direction. So the end of NATO is coming for all the reasons I've just outlined. It's become economically and politically and socially impossible to carry this on. It has been surviving for the last 30 years basically down to the fact that it had no real opponents. As soon as a real one actually emerged, one that the NATO countries themselves had conjured into existence by their intransigence, it was revealed that they had nothing to offer. They could cause a lot of Ukrainians to die, but that was about it. So we have a lot of comments in the chat, so let's go through. Oz, good evening to you. Eduardo, good evening to you. Dean says, very encouraging report of a Douglas Murray Israel fundraiser event being cancelled tonight as the venue's staff refused to work despite being offered triple pay. Excellent piece of work or action there. I will look up the details of that and cover it more tomorrow. Good on whoever was organising that staff boycott. And I think we can all agree that Douglas Murray is one of the most unbearable buffoons that Britain has to offer. And that is up against a lot of competition. Muzzle Paint, solidarity to you. Hello to Kent out in Minneapolis. Hello to Michael out in Canada. And we have 88 of you watching the stream right now. That's good stuff. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Comrade Hello Hi says, is Barotba still around? They apparently dissolved, but they are part of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. I don't know. I will look it up and see what I can find out about that. Movie Maker Joe, good evening to you. And Edward Allen, good evening to you. Fish Biscuits, hello to you out there in Canada. Gleb Perch says Barotba was banned by the government. Okay, well, I'll have a look into that. HM, thoughts on Adam Curtis? I grew up when I was like in my late teens watching Adam Curtis's film Century of the Self. Century of the Self was one of the first pieces of documentary making I saw that actually interested me. And it's, to be honest, I mean, I kind of owe Curtis a little bit in terms of my doing even this, because it was what got me actually interested in doing, like, if not documentary work, then putting together like media projects. And of course, I find him politically, the best way I could describe him is essentially he's still sort of a very moderate, I would call him a Burkean social democrat, kind of guy who might write for Compact magazine. But the way in which I consider him now is like he's allowed to be on the BBC for the reason that basically he'll come up with a lot of interesting footage. I think the thing I find most interesting about him now, he's not the politics, because they're just sort of bland ruling class Burkean sockdem, as I said. He has a very good artistic eye, though. I mean, his shot selection I find interesting. The musical cues that I always used to find interesting. I'm not sure if I still would. I haven't watched anything of his in a couple of years now. I think he sort of ran out of juice. I think his sort of peak period was that early to middle 2000s period. I think I may go back and review some of his programs if there's a demand for me to do that. I think Century of the Self is very interesting. The Power of Nightmares had some interesting points to it. I think it was a skewed presentation of that, though, in the way he put that together. I honestly don't remember some of the others because it all started blurring into one. Basically, he's allowed to do what he does because he basically reaches the conclusion in every single one of his documentaries that basically nothing can be done. His basic thing is, the basic premise he always presents is that and I'll do an Adam Curtis impression, in 1972 in Phnom Penh, Pol Pot, a man trained in Marxist-Leninism, had an idea. This idea became a mass slaughter. And from there, we get to President Reagan. President Reagan, in 1981, had an idea. That idea was neoliberalism. Neoliberalism got him shot by a man who was obsessed with Jodie Foster. This led to poor results. In 1997, Tony Blair had an idea. The idea was marketability combined with social democracy. This ended in the Iraq War and the crash of 2007 with poor results. You see where this is going. By the end of his documentary series, basically one is left with the idea, with the perspective that any project towards any form of radical change always basically folds in on itself and leads to poor results or leads to the opposite of what you intended. And so his politics are fundamentally, I would say, even though he has expressed basically sympathy with social democratic positions, he's a bourgeois pessimist. That's why I said he's very Burkean in terms of the belief system first outlined by Edmund Burke. Interesting, but very, very flawed. Good evening to Beju. And Guy Schurer says, I don't know this channel. Well, welcome along. I am new and do not know if you answer questions. I do answer questions. Can you explain what happened to the Green Party in Germany? Jesus Christ, you're straight in there with the big one, aren't you? And greetings to you in Brazil, Guy. Well, I'm presuming that if you say what happened to it, that you yourself take the point of view that the Green Party used to be something good. Now, let's be clear. There were probably people in it, in fact, I know there were, who considered themselves to be anti-capitalist at some point. They considered themselves to be internationalists of some variety or another. A lot of them came from the 68 generation. But what we saw with their progression through the 80s was that they were very easily absorbed, first into the political machinery of the old West German state, and then they were very easily incorporated into coalition arrangements in the newly unified Federal Republic of Germany in the 90s. And at each stage, as German bourgeois politics develops, the leadership of the Green Party basically went through the same process which the Social Democrats had gone through, which is that they completely accommodated themselves to German capitalism. I mean, they always were. They were, at best, reformist. There were some people in the Greens, on the left of the Greens, who considered themselves to be anti-capitalist, but from my reading of them, they were always a bit vague about what this actually meant. They certainly weren't communists. And this sort of amorphous mix of various sort of pseudo-radical social democratic and sort of left soc-dem beliefs got easily pushed, really, into coalition with Gerhard Schröder. And then, of course, you get Joschka Fischer, the old 1968 radical, going around agitating heavily for the bombing of Yugoslavia and delivering that, along with Schröder. And then you get I think Fischer was even very much in favor of the Iraq war, even though Schröder officially turned on it for cynical purposes to win an election, mainly. So the fault was there in the foundations, to answer Guy's question. And the fault revealed itself as German imperialism reasserted itself as a more powerful semi-independent actor in the 90s. The Greens went right along with it and in fact became steadily more and more rabidly imperialist, till you get like Baerbock running around now, who sounds like John Bolton in a skirt. So, I mean, that's a very quick overview of the German Greens. By the way, it's the same is true of the British Greens, the Irish Greens. Greens anywhere always end up the same way. If there's demand, again, I will come back to that question in more depth. Martin says, Marx's third law of capitalist motion, the tendential fall in the rate of profit, it's the key to understanding world history and why real communists like Alex must always get it right. Well, talking about making a rod for our own backs there, Martin, but you are, of course, correct. Again, for those who want an explanation of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, I find the blog kept by the economist, he writes under the name of Michael Roberts. I believe the blog is called The Next Recession. His work is quite useful. I by no means agree with Roberts' political conclusions on a whole range of issues, but his explanations of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall are useful to read, as are Andrew Kleiman's. Again, there are many different issues with both men's political positions, but their academic work is solid, and Kleiman's work on the tendency rate of profit to fall is useful because it's crammed with data to support his theories. So do check those out if you get the chance and you want to learn more about that. The next question or comment comes from Staffy97, who says, the royal family even denied Prince Andrew's friendship with Jeffrey Epstein and what Prince Andrew did on Epstein Island. Yeah, well, he wasn't alone there. Anybody asked Richard Branson what he was doing on there yet? They were neighbours after all. I mean, old Prince Andrew, he's a sleazy scumbag, but he's following in the footsteps of his father, who was notorious also for that kind of behaviour. Look, these people behave in the same way they always have, which is that they regard the world as theirs to abuse as they see fit. So Prince Andrew was unfortunate from his perspective to be born into a time when these things were reported and started to come out. And now he's disgraced, and rightly so. And will have to probably get a job at Pizza Express or something. But this is who they are. This is who they've always been. The church-going, ribbon-cutting, respectable face is just a mask. In reality, royalty is always some of the most depraved people you could possibly find. And I'm sure our comrade raising that point knows that very well. Comrade Hello Hi says, if you weren't a British Marxist-Leninist YouTuber, would you be born as a South American communist militant? Well, if we're into alternative histories here, I don't know. Maybe. Who knows? If I wasn't there, I would like to go to the South American nations. Certainly it's a very interesting place. It's not a place I've ever been to. So maybe. Who knows? If we're posing alternative pasts and futures. Do you think, asks Meme Dealer 666, do you think the fall of NATO and the EU will bring a more far-right organisation? I would say that there's a chance that with the fall of these organisations that we end up with more reactionary regimes coming into power. That's a risk. I'm not going to pretend that it's an automatic victory for our side. It opens up opportunities, is my argument here. So yeah, there's every chance that the next phase we go through is one of more reactionary governments getting into power. They will be confronted, though, with all the same problems that I've just outlined that the current governments are confronted with. They will be compelled down one of two paths to try and revive capitalism. Dramatic upscaling of imperialist wars overseas, which, of course, it's not just in with regard to hostility towards Russia that is a factor, but also the hostility towards China, and of course the fact that the nationalist risings in places like the Sahel are pushing the imperialists out. So if you get, for instance, a fascist or government coming into power in Europe, which is possible, these tendencies are there, and they look to do one of their fake revivals of the nation or whatever other shit they talk these days, and they turn to try and carry this out, they will be blocked on the one level because more and more nations are actually developing the capacity to tell the imperialists where to go. So the super profits they used to extract from the African nations, for instance, are going to be limited. So where else do they turn? Well, they will be obliged to carry out a gigantic assault on the living standards of the working class, which it was the only other way for them to revive domestic capitalism in the way that fascists have done so in the past. So the world we're moving into, or the reality we're moving into, is fraught with risks. And unless communists manage to get building serious, what I would call red bases in working class areas and building our influence and building our organization, then we run the risk of being outflanked by the fascists, who of course have a lot of institutional advantages over us in that they are rooted in the bourgeoisie, have much bigger budgets and access to all kinds of things that we don't have. Our strength must be our organization within the working class itself. Their strength is in the fact that they come from the bourgeois themselves. Adam Marks says, I know the stance of the CPGBML is that Russia is not an imperialist country, but never read how they came to that conclusion according to Lenin. Can you elaborate on this? I can elaborate on that, Adam. but as it's getting on towards the end of the stream tonight, I can't do so tonight. Can you indicate in the chat if you are willing to have that question taken up later this week? Or email me on the address that's in the chat or that's in the description box for this episode. Because I'm happy to go into that, but it's going to take me at least an hour to do so, and I have to be up in the morning, basically. Okay, Comrade Hello Hi accuses my party of taking L's, such as Rojava and the support for Iran. Well, now we get into controversial territory. It's not a question, Comrade, of not liking Rojava. I wouldn't put it that way. AJ Williams says, don't think contemporary Russia is imperialist, and he is correct. So, Guy Schreur says, Baerbock is frightening. Baerbock's an absolute fucking psychopath. But, I mean, I've covered the Kurdish national question before on these streams. I'm not sure if the comrade who poses that question was watching. Again, like, the problem with, one of the problems with the whole Rojava thing was the way, basically, it got very easily taken over and used as a tool by American imperialism. And we have discussed this on this stream before. The Kurdish national question is one which the imperialists have manipulated to their advantage over and over again. It doesn't invalidate the claims that the Kurds make with regard to defense of their national culture or traditions and their wish not to have that erased by various different regimes across the region. But the fact that their political leadership was prepared to make an open alliance with the American imperialists in order to continue to divide the Syrian state, well, that's a reactionary turn. Yes, I'm aware, comrade, you asked about the MLKP and the TKP-ML. It looks like we're going to have to do a full thing on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to confine the comments on it to what I've already said, and we will have to rotor something in on this later in the week to cover this, because I don't want to dismiss this in just a two-line thing. I think we have to go into it in some detail to outline the arguments here. So, and Oz is right. The Kurds and their fight isn't helped by aligning with US imperialism. It wasn't helped back in the day when they got manipulated into rising up against Saddam Hussein. It's not helping now. A lot of people in Britain and the United States, and this was true of me 10 years ago, had a romantic vision of the Rojava rebellion divorced from the wider context. So they're not helping themselves, I'm sorry to say. But again, we will go into this in more depth at a future date, because I'm aware that there will be a lot to say on it. Beju says the Greens are just a green tinge of Tory, another bourgeois party in Britain and similar to their German counterparts. Yes, that's very true. Paul Gassari says Prince Andrew's just a worse liar. He's not only a worse liar, I mean, he's also subject to a level of media scrutiny that, like, his father never was. His father was just as bad, the old Prince Phil. Like, notorious, like, whoremonger, shall we say. Notorious man about town. Probably got up to exactly the same thing with exactly the same demographic, shall we say, that his son did. But he got away with it because back then there was only 7 daily newspapers, all of which were controlled very rigorously by the government. There was no internet. There was 2 TV stations, and radio stations were all very tightly controlled from the centre. You can't get away with that now. Not to the same degree. Yes, they still cover a lot of things up, but it tends to come out. Right, okay, we got up to 94 a minute ago, so that was excellent. Okay, this is going to be, I'm going to draw this to a close for this evening. We've had really good numbers on this tonight, so thank you everybody for joining the stream and for liking and sharing it. Be sure to like and share it if you haven't done so already. This will be available on Patreon for subscribers very soon. The Patreon episode for this week got delayed because I've had too many other things to do today, but the edition on Romania is coming up later this week. Thank you to everybody who's contributed to a very good Q&A discussion in the chat tonight. Join me again tomorrow as I attempt to make this programme into the viable competitor to Newsnight in order that I can claim from the BBC licence fee. Right. Thank you again, and I will now throw you back over to the musical interlude.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد جيل من شعب مجاهد عاش يبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد